Mr. President, Madam Vice President, members of the court, it is an honor to appear before you as the agent of the Republic of Armenia. This is the second week of hearings in the cases brought to the court by Armenia and Azerbaijan. The court undoubtedly has by now understood the key differences between the two cases. Azerbaijan is, of course, free to accuse Armenia of whatever it wishes, but what Azerbaijan cannot do is to extend the court's jurisdiction beyond this limit under the CERT. And it is Azerbaijan's attempt to do so that gives rise to Armenia's objections now before the court. As Armenia's counsel will explain today, Armenia's objection to the court jurisdiction, ratione temporis, and the admissibility of Azerbaijan's claims relates to allegations concerning the First Nagorno-Karabakh War and its immediate aftermath, a period of time that falls entirely outside the court's jurisdiction because the CERT did not enter into force between the parties until 15 September 1996. To be clear, the First Nagorno-Karabakh War was an unspeakable tragedy that engulfed the region as the Soviet Union collapsed. After almost a century of divide and rule by the Soviet Union, the peoples of the region sought to exercise their self-determination. The conflict displaced and destroyed the lives of countless innocent Armenians and Azerbaijanis alike. But that is why Armenia, Azerbaijan, and authorities in Nagorno-Karabakh committed in what is known the Bishkek Protocol of 5 May 1994, followed by 12 May 1994 trilateral ceasefire agreement, and which were further confirmed by the Minsk Group to ensure both ceasefire and reciprocal return of refugees. The authorities in Nagorno-Karabakh vigorously observed the ceasefire agreement and would have welcomed the return of refugees. In contrast, Azerbaijan doubled down on its discrimination against ethnic Armenians, refused to permit UN access to the region, and repeatedly violated the ceasefire agreement, including by, in its own president's words, quote, starting the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War. But let me be equally clear. Armenia also vigorously denies that it has ever endorsed racist ideologies, illegally occupied Azerbaijan's territory, or controlled the authorities in Nagorno-Karabakh, notwithstanding Azerbaijan's agents' attempts to, last week to suggest otherwise. It will also not surprise the members of the court that Armenia has its own perspective on the origins of the conflict in First Nagorno-Karabakh War. Armenia set out the basic facts of the conflict on pages 42 to 63 of its memorial in the Armenia versus Azerbaijan case. However, Armenia took care to present those facts as what they are, part of the historical context, and not the facts specific to Armenia's application. Nevertheless, there can be no question that Armenia has innumerable grievances against Azerbaijan concerning the period both prior and during the First Nagorno-Karabakh War. It is, of course, well known that during the Soviet era, ethnic Armenians in the Azerbaijan Soviet Socialist Republic endured discrimination in many forms, including restricted social services and economic resources, and suppression of their cultural and linguistic rights. Armenian historical monuments also were allowed to decay or were outright destroyed, either through neglect or deliberate vandalism. As a result of these policies, by 1987, dozens of Armenian towns and villages in Nagorno-Karabakh had simply disappeared. The population of ethnic Armenians in the province of Nakhichevan fell from 50,000 in 1917 to only 3,400 in 1979. Likewise, the ethnic Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh had fallen from 94.4% of the overall population in 1921 to 75.9% by 1979. None of this was a coincidence. On the contrary, it was the intended result of Azerbaijan's deliberate strategy to replace the ethnic Armenians population with Azerbaijanis. In President Aliyev's own words, when referring to his father, the former leader of Azerbaijan's Soviet Socialist Republic and President of Azerbaijan, and I quote, "Under great leader Heydar Aliyev, the percentage of Azerbaijani population in Nagorno-Karabakh increased sharply. It doubled to reach 30%. If Heydar Aliyev had not left for Moscow in 1982 and stayed in Azerbaijan, then the Azerbaijani population could have reached 50% within 10 years. End of quote. As his father himself admitted, and I quote, "I tried to increase the number of Azerbaijanis there and reduce the number of Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh." End of quote. It is in this context of blatant racist hatred, acknowledged by Azerbaijan's contemporaneous and current leadership, that the ethnic Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh began a peaceful pursuit of their right to self-determination in the late 1980s. But the movement was met with violent ethnic hatred. A series of brutal pogroms of ethnic Armenians were carried out in Sumgait, Baku, and Kirovabad between February 1988 and January 1990. During these pogroms, Azerbaijani mobs killed, raped, maimed, and burned alive hundreds of ethnic Armenians. In Baku alone, Azerbaijani nationalists were allowed by local authorities to roam the streets, committing brutal murders, torture, and rapes, including of little girls in front of their parents. In 1991, Azerbaijani forces carried out Operation Ring, which violently expelled ethnic Armenians from their homes, emptying 20 villages in then Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast and adjacent regions with indigenous Armenian population. Operation Ring was in effect aimed at deportation of ethnic Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh and adjacent regions, and was carried out with an unprecedented degree of violence. When the Soviet Union officially dissolved, full-scale war broke out. Azerbaijan laid siege to Stepanakert in Nagorno-Karabakh, shelling civilians for 6 months. Azerbaijani forces also massacred civilians, took hostages, desecrated cultural sites, and ethnically cleansed Azerbaijan of hundreds of thousands of ethnic Armenians. As a result of the violent pogroms in the First Nagorno-Karabakh War, approximately 48,000 ethnic Armenians were displaced to Armenia from Nagorno-Karabakh. Approximately 360,000 were displaced to Armenia from the rest of Azerbaijan, and tens of thousands were internally displaced from Armenia's border regions to other parts of Armenia. But, Mr. President, members of the court, Armenia acknowledges that the facts that Azerbaijan did all these things does not bring them within the jurisdiction of the court. As Armenia's esteemed counsel will explain, the court's jurisdiction is confined to the period after the CERT entered into force between the parties in September of 1996. And Armenia has carefully respected the limits of that jurisdiction. Azerbaijan, in contrast, has not. But it cannot be, as Azerbaijan would have it, that the parties to the CERT would have wished to allow those who later acceded to the convention to gain a procedural advantage by penalizing those who earlier acceded to the convention. It cannot be that Armenia, in the midst of First Nagorno-Karabakh War, agreed to immediately subject itself to possible claims by Azerbaijan in the future, while limiting itself to bringing claims concerning whatever period after which Azerbaijan might later unilaterally decide to accede. And it cannot be that Azerbaijan may bring unfounded allegations relating to the period between July 1993 and September 1996, but that Armenia is without remedy for the numerous acts of racial discrimination that Azerbaijan committed during that period itself. Even if the court has jurisdiction over Azerbaijan's claims prior to the entry into force of the cert between the parties in 1996, Armenia respectfully submits that those claims would still be inadmissible. Azerbaijan cannot be allowed to sit on its alleged grievances under the cert for nearly 30 years, only to finally pursue them after many witnesses are long gone and the evidence has disappeared. And Azerbaijan particularly cannot be allowed to do this after it unilaterally changed the status quo by attacking Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020, and then expelled its remaining ethnic Armenian population in 2023 in violation of the cert and the court's orders, thereby further preventing Armenia from marshalling its defense. Armenia's other objections relate to Azerbaijan's claims concerning the environment and landmines, respectively. In contrast to Armenia's claims, to which Azerbaijan objected last week, every one of which was supported by overwhelming evidence of mistreatment of ethnic Armenians on explicitly ethnic grounds, the claims to which Armenia objects are, on their face, incapable of falling within the provisions of the cert. With respect to landmines, the court has already found on two separate occasions, and on the basis of nearly identical body of evidence, that the cert does not even plausibly impose any obligation on Armenia to take measures to enable Azerbaijan to undertake the mining or to cease and desist from planting landmines. Azerbaijan has offered no new evidence suggesting that these claims are capable of falling under the cert now. Indeed, landmines and booby traps are inherently indiscriminate and therefore incapable of distinguishing between members of different national or ethnic groups. Moreover, many of the landmines in question were planted by Azerbaijan, and it was Azerbaijan that vehemently obstructed the mining in Nagorno-Karabakh for decades by blacklisting the sole humanitarian demining organization operating in Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as penalizing its activities. And while Azerbaijan is now trying to reformulate its landmine claims in a different way to survive our jurisdictional challenge, the reformulation itself is fatally flawed. Azerbaijan's claims concerning the alleged destruction of the environment likewise fall outside the jurisdiction of the court. Even if alleged environmental harm were in principle capable of constituting racial discrimination in exceptional circumstances, it could not possibly do so here. Armenia could not have engaged in racial discrimination against ethnic Azerbaijanis who, according to Azerbaijan, no longer even lived there in the relevant territories and were not intended to return. Further, as a legal matter, Azerbaijan cannot show that the alleged environmental harm involved differential treatment of human beings, cannot show that the harms it alleges were based on the ethnic or national origin, and cannot show that they had any discriminatory purpose or disparate adverse effect. Mr. President, members of the court, the remainder of Armenia's presentation will proceed as follows. First, Mr. Lawrence Martin will explain why the court lacks jurisdiction ratione temporis with respect to Azerbaijan's claims relating to the First Nagorno-Karabakh War and its pre-15 September 1996 aftermath. Second, Professor Darjan will continue Armenia's submissions on the admissibility of the same claims. Third, Dr. Konstantinos Salonidis will address Armenia's objections to the court's jurisdiction, Ratione Materia, over Azerbaijan's claims regarding landmines and booby traps. Fourth, Ms. Alison MacDonald will explain why Azerbaijan's allegations concerning the environment fall outside the cert as well. Finally, Professor Sicilianos will explain why Armenia's preliminary objections have an exclusively preliminary character, thus should be decided at this stage. Mr. President, Madam Vice President, members of the Court, thank you for your kind attention. May I ask now that you invite Mr. Martin to the podium.
I thank the agent of Armenia for his statement. I now invite Mr. Lawrence Martin to take the floor. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Court, good morning. It's a privilege to appear before you today on behalf of the Republic of Armenia. This morning, I will address Armenia's first preliminary objection and explain why Azerbaijan's claims relating to the First Nagorno-Karabakh War